Okay, thank you for the speakers from the last session. And our last session of the day is a super exciting session. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So Chris Dixon is joining us for the very last session. Let me introduce Chris just before we dive into our topics. So Chris was a serial entrepreneur, and then he became a VC, funded a bunch of companies, a bunch of the early companies in the blockchain space. Then in 2018, he actually created an entire fund just devoted to the blockchain space, the A16Z crypto fund. And I guess in his dealings with all the various companies and entrepreneurs that he was talking to, he became a very prolific writer. So I don't know if you guys follow Chris's writing, but he's a very clear and prolific writer and explains the space extremely well. Earlier this year, actually, Chris wrote this book. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. I hope many of you read it, the Read, Write, Own book. This was a New York Times bestseller. It's a super interesting book to read. I highly recommend it. And so because of this book and the fact that Chris wrote it, I thought it would be really interesting to have a conversation with Chris that he could share his experiences with us. So Chris, thank you so much for coming. And let's welcome Chris to our session.
I think my quick Dan Benet story is I think we met like in the mid-2000s. I had a security startup, and I think I cold emailed you basically. And if you know Dan, you'll know that he's the kind of person that responds to cold emails from random people. And I got a chance to meet with him, and you were really helpful, and we've been friends ever since. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, and thanks for coming, Chris. So let's see. I wanted to start the conversation actually by literally asking you, why did you write this book?
Yeah.
What is it for?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of think of it like sort of trying to answer the question of like, what is this all for? Like, why are we building blockchains? Like, what's the purpose of all the, the kind of technical talks you've done today? Like, what's the societal goal? And specifically, I wanted to answer that question for kind of, am I getting echo? Am I okay? Is this okay? Sorry.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, it sounds weird to me. I wanted to answer that question sort of for the general audience, but also specifically for policymakers, because I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years in DC and other places trying to kind of explain the purpose of these things, why we care about it, and why we think there should be kind of smart regulation that provides clarity. And literally in those meetings, hundreds of meetings with policymakers, they would always ask what book to read. And there are a lot of great books about sort of Bitcoin and like the history of stuff, but I felt like there wasn't like a book that kind of summarized it all. And sort of from a societal point of view, like why does it matter? And specifically what I try and do in the book is break it down conceptually. Like what is it? What are blockchains? Why would you want them? And I think to understand that, it's important to understand the history of the internet. I've been working on the internet my whole career. And if you've been an internet entrepreneur or an investor, you know that the thing that matters on the internet from the point of view of economics or control are networks. So a network can be built with a protocol like the World Wide Web, HTTP, or email, SMTP, right? That's sort of an open, decentralized way to build a network. And that was the sort of dominant way to build networks in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, you had the rise of what I call corporate networks, which are networks that are centralized. So Facebook, Uber, eBay, et cetera, they're one company that controls that network. And networks matter because networks have network effects. So the more people that use a network, the more valuable it gets. And it's what creates essentially power and defensibility in these businesses, right? I mean, it's why you have, companies that control networks like Facebook or something, or Instagram or TikTok end up being very high margin, very powerful, very influential networks. And so my argument is that, what blockchains let you do is create networks. Like when people say Bitcoin is a ledger, sure, it's a ledger, but that's not why it's interesting. It's interesting because it's a network, right? It's a network that's a financial network that has certain properties that are different than other networks like PayPal. And so then I try to go very specifically and analyze what are those different properties? Like what is it about blockchain networks that make them special? And in summary, I kind of think of them as it's sort of a little bit thesis, antithesis, synthesis, protocol networks, corporate networks, blockchain networks. They combine the best features of the prior two kinds of networks. I like to say they combine the societal benefits of protocol networks, openness, decentralized software production, i.e. composability, low take rates, meaning that money flows to the edges of the network and not to the center of the network, community governance instead of sort of centralized governance, but also, so they sort of have the benefits of old style networks like the World Wide Web and protocol networks, But they have a lot of modern other features like the ability to manage a treasury and to allocate capital and do all these other things that blockchains can do. So they're kind of in my mind, kind of the best of both worlds. And if you believe kind of my way of framing this, the conclusion is that blockchains aren't just good for financial services, right? They're good for anything where you might want to build a network. And so that could be financial services. It can be, a AMM or sort of a DeFi thing or Bitcoin, a store of value, whatever it might be. But it could also be a social network or games or, systems, identity systems or whatever you might, anything that you've seen in the last 30 years where somebody has tried to build a network, that you can build a network using a blockchain, the same idea, and it'll have different properties. And I have specific, so sort of the book is, first third is history of the internet. I think that kind of stands on its own as a history of the internet, independent of blockchains. The next third is kind of a deep dive into what blockchains are and these specific properties of what make them different. And in the third section, I kind of speculate as to 7 application areas that I find interesting, not exhaustive, but just, to give people a sense of it, because you often hear like, what problem did blockchain solve and these kinds of questions, and I want to take that head on. So anyways, that's the book. I'm hoping it's a book, probably folks here, I imagine it's a very sophisticated audience, like probably some of it is redundant for you, hopefully maybe some of the history and other parts are new, but specifically I hope it's a book that you would give to like your friends and colleagues as a book to kind of as a one-stop shop intro to the topic.
I'm sure you gave this book to a lot of the policymakers.
Yeah. It's like blanketed DC with it. I go with stacks of books.
So do you have any? So a lot of the folks here are kind of asked to opine about blockchains and such. Do you have any advice on how to speak to policymakers about the space?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think that a couple of things. One is that because of the origins of this kind of movement being in kind of Bitcoin and maybe sort of more on like the libertarian side of politics, that branding is very strong in DC. And so honestly, you walk in there and you start talking about, sort of quote unquote normal use cases like DeFi and stable coins. And that alone, I've heard many times, wow, I hadn't heard that. We all sit around and talk about it, but it really just hasn't kind of propagated outside of.
You're saying folks in DC don't know about stablecoins?
I think most people in the world, and particularly in DC, think of blockchain mainly as Bitcoin and as sort of this alternative, hard money alternative to the government, right? And that's immediately threatening to policymakers. And that's just not going to work in DC. To say like we're going to replace the US dollar or something like, it's just simply not. Like whether some people would disagree with me, I don't think that will be a winning argument. And so I think a much more powerful argument is to talk about all these other kinds of interesting use cases. And specifically, so for example, I like to talk about the take rates. So take rate, just for definitions, is a term that goes back 25 years, it means the percentage of money flowing through a network that the network operator takes, right? And so, for example, social networks, it's close to 100%, meaning they, of the 150 billion in social networking revenue last year, YouTube is the only one that really shares revenue in any kind of de minimis way. The rest take all that revenue. You build a decentralized social network, like something like a Farcaster or Lens, and by default, all of the money that goes in from one side flows out to the other side. So for example, creators who create all the content on these networks, right? The network operators don't create the content, the creators do. They actually make all the money in a decentralized design as one example. Like the economics one's a good one. Finance is another good example where there's very high take rates. You take a ride sharing, Uber, I just the other day was in an Uber and you asked the driver how much he made and it was like $17 and I paid $60 and like, there are taxes and everything else, but like there's a very high take rate in almost all of these internet networks. And so that, for example, is just eye-opening, I think, to a lot of people like policymakers, and the prospect of building a new set of internet services where the money flows out to the software developers, to the creators, et cetera, is an interesting argument to them. Another thing I think for those who were in the entrepreneurial world in the kind of last 15, who've been sort of in it longer, there was basically like 2005 through 10, like the hot thing in Silicon Valley, like I was an entrepreneur then, was building on top of social networks. People saw social networks as like the new platform. So there were companies like Zynga, and there's a whole series of, I list them in my book, a whole series of sort of venture-backed companies building on Twitter and Facebook, in the same way people are building on ChatGPT today or something. And there was a whole generation of them, and they all basically got killed when all of those centralized social networks decided to deprecate their APIs. So it was like 2011, 12, they all started shutting down RSS and APIs and everything else. And that's something that if you build a blockchain network, you build a social network on a blockchain or some other kind of system, you can make strong commitments to developers, right? Like, if you know that if you build on top of Ethereum or you build on top of Uniswap or whatever it might be, that you know what the rules are as a developer, right? Maybe they have a take rate, maybe the governance can change a few things here and there, but they're not going to go and say tomorrow that you can't build software or you can't build an Ethereum client, you can't. So there's a much greater degree of freedom and persistence and sort of long-term viability for developers building on these platforms, which is very, very important. I think an interesting, an interesting kind of historical thing is open source software. So, open source software now is probably 90+% of software running in the world. Linux is the dominant operating system in the world. For most of my career, open source, like in the 90s and 2000s, open source was considered this kind of weird fringe thing. Probably started really getting big in the probably mid-2000s and going mainstream. I think an interesting question is how did this go? How did open source software like Linux go from being kind of this fringe political movement to being the dominant operating system in the world? And I think the answer, in my mind, is composability, meaning that it's the fact that all these different developers from all over the world can get together and contribute to things like Linux and other open source projects, and in a way that you sort of, that Warren Buffett, I think, says that compounding interest is the eighth wonder of the world, and the same, because you get this sort of compounding effect. I think in the same way composability, you get this kind of knowledge compounding effect of software getting better and better, right? And so all the work you're doing here, right, everything is talked about on stage, it's open source. You can see this work and build on top of it, and that ends up having these compounding effects. But a prerequisite of composability is you need to know as a developer that you can build this and you're not going to have the rules change on you, right? Because if you go and you trust these platforms, there's sort of a whole generation of entrepreneurs who trusted the last wave of platforms and got burned. That was, for me, personally, a very, very influential time was seeing all of those.
So I have to ask, this idea of composability, this is something you're actually able to explain to folks in DC, policymakers?
That's a harder one. I think in DC, I try to focus on the economics maybe, and some of the other kind of. Another one I like to talk about is AI. Obviously the stuff happening in AI is very exciting. Our firm is investing a lot in AI. I think, though, that there's a lot of interesting challenges that AI raises that I think blockchains can sort of provide the antidote to. So one example are deep fakes and sort of bots and all these other kinds of things. Like, to me, the obvious answer to these problems is you need a real identity system for the internet. The internet never really had one. You have DNS and things, but DNS, people forget, it's a business product mainly. Like, most consumers don't have websites today. It just didn't, it's $8 and there's a whole bunch of, a year and all these other kinds of points of friction. And so, what if everybody on the internet had a low-cost, accessible, easy-to-use identity where they could prove they're human, like, prove they're not a bot, and then, if they create a piece of media, they could attest to that media being theirs, as an example. And so you have sort of a system of trust instead of kind of default distrust. That's one example. I mean, there's a bunch of interesting stuff going on around people trying to put kind of like copyright information for training data and for the ability to remix media and things on blockchains.
But actually, along those lines,
decentralized compute networks.
Oh yeah,
a whole bunch. Like, you can sort of take every stack of AI training and inference, and you can, for each layer, I think people probably here are aware, maybe some of them working on it. People are building interesting decentralized versions of those, which makes, which I think helps. It's important societally because it helps counter AI. I think AI right now, with the the high capital requirements and data requirements, is naturally centralizing. Like, it's headed now, like, where you need, I don't know what, 100,000 H100s or something to train a frontier model. And so there's going to be 5 to 10 companies probably who can do that. And hopefully a lot of this software is open source. Like, I think Meta's doing some great work there, and Mistral and others. But wouldn't it be nice if any startup could get access to that same training cluster, for example, or fine-tuning data or whatever it might be? So sort of all the different things that a big company might have access to that gives them advantage in AI. What if you could decentralize those various layers and make them therefore more accessible, and therefore counter what's happening now, which is there's sort of 5 big tech companies that control most of the internet, and the concern would be that innovations like AI left unchecked would further that consolidation. So, like, how do we, I think that's sort of, to me, that's actually, when I talk to policymakers, the thing I talk a lot about is just, and that's actually in the intro of the book, is just sort of the centralization of the internet. The internet was meant to be decentralized, and we're really losing that. And I worry that right now, like, you just look at the data, like, look at what the networks are doing now. Like, Twitter is now banning links. Like they're all trying to keep you more engaged. They're trying to they're basically kind of really the traffic going to the open web is declining. You're going to end up in a situation where there's sort of 5 social networks and 5 kind of AI search engine type things, and that's what people use, and linking out is deprecated, and what's the business model in that world for content providers? Like today, a content provider, like most content providers, they get indexed by Google, and then you click through, and then they run ads or have subscriptions. Like in an AI world, you're just going to get an answer. You're not going to need to click through. So are we going to just end up with an internet with 5 companies? Like what is that? What is the incentive structure for that internet, for the future internet, where you have AI systems and social networks and things? I think that's an important question. I mean, people sort of think it's, I don't know, is it over? The internet's modern internet, commercial internet's 30 years old. One argument would be this is sort of like the automobile industry. There's it started off with 1,000 companies in Detroit in 1900-ish, and then it eventually consolidated into 5 companies, and maybe that's what the internet will be like, or maybe it won't be, and we can sort of fight back against that, and we can kind of return the internet to its original ideals as a decentralized and open system. I hope so. I think that's why I got involved with the internet. I thought that was an exciting architecture. It incentivized innovation and creativity. If you don't have a business model for paying creators and everything is AI generated, so what does that mean? You're gonna just sort of remove these tens of millions of people that make their living on the internet, or are they gonna end up working in sort of data center style, which is what's happening now? The AI companies are going out and farming out, fine-tuning data to offshore data centers, and that's, to me, it's kind of this dystopian outcome that we might be headed for, where there's 5 AI, the internet becomes 5 AI, kind of search engines and 5 social networks, and all the data is farmed in from offshore, and then all the, we think about it from a venture capital perspective of that's going to be bad from a startup perspective, right? Our business depends on the internet being dynamic, and that's another argument that we make a lot with policymakers too, is just it's good. I think historically people in DC have recognized that having a dynamic startup economy, in software and the internet is good for innovation. Yeah, Google invented the transformers, but OpenAI commercialized them. There's a long history, Xerox PARC and Apple. You need a vibrant startup ecosystem, I think, to really kind of take these innovations further.
Yeah, these are all pretty consequential questions. So it's good to hear that policymakers are receptive to that. So actually, along those lines, let's continue kind of to the next topic I wanted to discuss a little bit. So I'm sure everybody in this room is getting asked by people, the number one question that folks outside of the space always ask is, what are blockchains good for? Yeah, what are blockchains good for? I get asked that a lot. And so obviously people have heard of the financial application. Yeah. But the question is, what are the other areas that have a good product market fit for blockchains? In the book, you kind of cover a bunch of other areas. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what, other than finance, what are they good for?
Yeah, I mean, look, the finance ones are important. So there's obviously Bitcoin, which, depending on your kind of monetary views, I think it clearly has some product market fit with a certain, kind of hard money crowd. I think DeFi clearly does too. I mean, just look at the volumes of AMM, like Uniswap, and the stuff that MakerDAO and Aave and all these folks are doing are really interesting. And I think people underappreciate, the fact that you can basically perform a lot of modern banking functions in a better way without, using sort of having all this kind of institutions and people is a pretty impressive feat. I think the limiting factor, and I'll probably come back to policy a lot here because I'm kind of obsessed with it, because I think that's the limiting factor for the most part with DeFi, is just that it's sort of stuck in a playpen right now because you can only really use crypto assets, because creating a bridge to sort of real world assets or, sort of traditional assets is just a giant kind of regulatory headache. I deal with it all the time. I think once we figure that out and you can just sort of take, the rest of the economy and use these tools, I think it'll become much more powerful and less like kind of this kind of circular playpen sort of feeling, sandbox. Stable coins are, trillions of dollars in transactions of stable coins. Again, not to be broken record, but there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and that one I think we're very close to getting a lot more clarity on, and I think that will be important. I mean, look, the dollar is the most popular U.S. export, period. I mean, it's like Coca-Cola and, I don't know, Marvel movies and iPhones and the dollar are our most popular products. So And it's just, and you see a lot of adoption around the world, and blockchains make it very easy. And there's a lot of, like you have companies like Stripe, they just gave a really interesting demo at their last developer day, showing off stablecoins. I think it's really compelling for a lot of payment companies and a lot of businesses who typically pay around 2.5% of all revenues to payment processing, which is kind of ridiculous. You know, if you think about, you know, payments are just moving bits around, the fact that 2.5% of all internet revenue goes to that. So, I mean, I don't think, like you said, besides finance, I don't think we should dismiss that. Okay. You know, I think stuff around, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening with NFTs. I wouldn't say it's like full product market fit, but there's like games and people, you know, artists and creators doing, even now NFTs are down and everyone's negative on it, still billions in volume of people buying NFTs. And NFTs to me are interesting because they are a digital asset where someone creative can create something like in a game or some other kind of thing. And to me, the most interesting thing about it is you're removing all the middle layers so that all the money, except for whatever, like OpenSea and these marketplaces charge like 2.5%, you have 97% or something going to the creators. And so it's just the economic fact that you've got new business model, like I would say early stage, but really interesting new business models that where all of the money goes to the kind of edges of the network, to the creators and the game makers. And so, like, for example, there's a popular game called Eve that folks might know. It's been around like 20 years. It's like a spaceship kind of MMO game, and they're making a blockchain version where instead of it being kind of a pseudo-economy, it's a real economy, and you can design spaceships and have this all these sort of economic relationships. And then, but it's interesting is you can take the objects in and out of the economy and have real value behind them. And I think in the future you could imagine, you know, these kind of decentralized universes that are kind of games and workplaces where they have, you know, where the users truly own the assets and you have real kind of economies that aren't, you have sort of pseudo economies now. Like for those who play games, you'll know that the dominant business model for modern video games like League of Legends and Fortnite is virtual goods. So most of these games are free and you buy virtual goods, but it's a very centralized planned economy where the vast majority of the revenues go to the game maker. And so instead, what these games are playing around with are this idea of sort of much more of a peer-to-peer economy. So like one user might create some virtual good and then some other user buys that good and maybe the game maker takes a tax on it, but it's like 5%, not 95%. And so you have sort of a true peer-to-peer economy, which I think is really interesting going forward.
Then you can use the gaming assets for like real-world activities.
Yeah, or you can trade them across games, or you can have, you know, you sort of users have persistent inventories that can kind of go across different things. So you kind of flip the model, right? Right now, you know, every time you go to a new website or a new game or a new application, like you start over from scratch and it's fully controlled. It's like a fully controlled, siloed kind of corporate-owned experience. And instead, you flip the model where, you know, sort of users have persistent identities and, you know, you have, like, I think the interesting thing with these new social networks is that you can take your identity and your follower list from social network to social network in the same way that you can take your email list. You know, the reason that Substack, newsletters are having a renaissance for those who don't follow it from the media world. Journalists and things leaving, going to places like Substack. Why are they going back to email, you know, a 40-year-old protocol? Is it because it's a better protocol than messaging or something? No, it's because of the low take rates, because it's like a 10% you pay to Substack and not, you know, very high take rates of social networks. Why is that? Is that because the email news providers are nicer and like to take less money? No, it's because it's a decentralized network where the user, the creator, the switching costs are much lower. If they raise the take rates above 10%, the creator would switch to a different newsletter provider, right? So all these things are, like, all the economics of the internet, and this is sort of the point of the book, are downstream consequences of these architectural decisions. And so, you know, sort of creating new services that work more like email and the web where you can switch providers. Same thing with websites. Like, why do you only pay whatever you pay, 10, you know, 50 bucks or whatever to Squarespace or Wix to have your website? Again, is it because they're nicer and they don't, like, why don't they take part of your revenue? Why don't they take more of the way that TikTok does? Because they can't, because you can switch, because that's the way the web's architected, right? So all of these kind of things are consequences of the architecture. So it'll take a while to build, like, a lot of these use cases are more ambitious, and I think will take longer to build out. And I think you've got to kind of get to a point where people get so dissatisfied with a lot of the status quo, and they keep their, you know, continuing to squeeze people more and more, like the creators. And I think that dissatisfaction is growing, and at some point, this is why you have these pendulum swings, I think, and like in the history of computing, you have pendulum swings back and forth between kind of decentralized systems like Linux and, you know, centralized systems like Windows, and I think you'll have a similar dynamic here on the internet.
Yeah.
So the short answer is, like, I think stablecoins, DeFi, Bitcoin, somewhat NFTs have product market fit, and I think there's a bunch of TBD categories that are kind of nascent.
Makes sense. Actually, I want to open it up to questions from the audience too. So you guys think of questions that you're interested in having Chris answer. But before I do that, there's 2 more questions I wanted to ask. We'll see how we do on time. So one question I wanted to ask is, there are obviously a lot of folks here who are from blockchain companies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about like what does the space look like now for blockchain entrepreneurs, and do you have any advice for new founders?
Yeah. I think it's a pretty good. I mean, for those who haven't been in the tech business for as long as I have, the pendulum swings always. This is not the sort of crypto summer winter cycles. Might be more exaggerated in crypto, but it's not unique to it. And there will be, trust me, on the financial side, there'll be cycles in every category, and there have been throughout my career. I started my career really in earnest in the 2000s when the internet was, itself was going through a winter. And so we're a little bit in winter, although there's still a lot of people funding blockchain startups, and it just doesn't seem to be, for the most part. I mean, it's always hard to raise money. I wouldn't ever belittle that. It's a challenge, and it's very hard to start a company and a project. But I think it's, one of the areas where VCs are funding stuff today. I think AI is obviously the other big one. I think, the people that are having a bigger challenge with fundraising are people that are maybe doing things that aren't part of those 2 categories.
Which 2 categories?
I still think blockchain, and besides AI, is probably the one, kind of where more money is. Yeah, and then in terms of advice, you say advice for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, let's say.
That could be a whole book. Well, I think I'll just be specific to this period because I think it's kind of we're in kind of I don't know what, it's sort of a volatile, I don't know if it's a bear market, bull market, I don't know, it's some kind of weird period, and I think we're just, and look, there's a lot of trouble with the regulation and the lack of clarity there.
In some countries.
In some countries, yeah. I think, I don't know, look, I would say overall, what I've found is that any new interesting area of technology takes time. I think there's a lot of revisionism around this, like AI as an example. You know this, Dan, has been, 1943 was the first paper on neural networks. I started an AI company. My second company in 2008 was an AI company. It was a machine learning company. And there was a long history of this, very long. There was an AI bubble, financial bubble in the 1980s. If you think it was just academic, it wasn't. There was a whole thing around expert systems and companies going public. And I think arguably now, I think it's pretty clearly now working as a technology for the first time. So it can take a very long time. And it's very hard you could sort of predict it based on like the number of transistors and GPUs and all this other kind of stuff. But it's also very hard to predict exactly when these things will tip. Mobile phones, there was if you want to watch this documentary on a company called General Magic, which was a lot of the original people that created the iPhone, but they were trying to do it, I don't know what it was, like 13 years before the iPhone, yeah. And so these things can just take time, and I think we're in one of those periods now, and so I would say, I guess my advice would be if you believe in this movement, that you just, that persistence pays off, and it's worth it to kind of stay focused. There's a tactical advice attached to that, like, you want to preserve capital as an example as an entrepreneur. Like when we work with blockchain startups, like a tip, if you're working on like a SaaS accounting system or something, you might raise 18 months of capital. Like I was involved with Coinbase for a long time, and they would always try to raise like 4 or 5 years of capital. Like there's just a lot more uncertainty in these kind of emerging categories than in, let's say, more mature categories. And so, you're sort of choosing to live life at the bottom of the early part of the S-curve and not the top of the S-curve. And there's pros and cons to that. And I think, but being smart about it and like preserving capital, like building a great core team, staying focused on a mission, that you really believe in and kind of a powerful use case you believe in, whether it's infrastructure applications. And I do think that people that do that are rewarded. And I think that my experience has been that there's sort of this phenomenon in Silicon Valley, I like to call it kids soccer. If you watch professional soccer, they all stay in their position and pass the ball. In kids soccer, there's like 22 kids running on the ball. In Silicon Valley, it's like kids soccer, where like every year or two, there's a new trend, and like everybody's doing the same thing. And like that works if you're OpenAI. They've obviously done a fantastic job. It generally doesn't work for like companies, 10 through 10,000 who do that or whatever. Maybe some of them will make it through, but like there's a lot of that happens. And so I would say, don't get seduced by that. Like, I mean, like, not to dismiss any other category, but just do whatever you're doing because you believe in it and and not because of the trends around you or what, the cocktail party chatter or whatever. And just stay, kind of focused on it.
That's actually good advice. Just do focus on the things you
maybe,
believe in.
By the way, maybe you believe, and again, I'm not trying to dismiss any other, I just want to be clear, like I'm very bullish on AI as an example, but you should be doing it because you believe in AI, not because it's like a trendy thing to do, right? And it's just like supply and demand, like right now, I mean, again, like there's like, I was in San Francisco recently and like, it's just like 1,000 people doing like customer service chatbots or whatever. And so there's just going to be so much oversupply in certain categories. And meanwhile, like to me, there's just obvious big ideas around blockchain startups, like some of the stuff I was mentioning with AI, where there's actually very few kind of credible companies doing. And so there's just like a lot more kind of, white space in this area.
Not to mention, you just have to spend a couple of days in this conference and you see all the technology that's being developed in the space, which is
and like a lot of good things like the infrastructure. I think we're finally probably at a point now, like there's clearly a lot of improvements to do, and that's what you've been talking about this conference. But we're at a point now, probably for the first time recently, I would say, with like 4844 and like the L2s on Ethereum and maybe Solana and some other things, where like it's probably just recently gotten good enough. So that you can do, so that you're not as infrastructure constrained. I wouldn't say fully, like there's people talk about a lot, like the UX and just getting the whole wallet experience, and maybe that requires account abstraction and intents and whatever. And you can always have lower gas fees and more security and everything else. But we're probably at a point now where, for probably the first time ever, I think, where, like getting down, the way I think about it is, we're basically at the point now where an application can subsidize gas costs, right? So like that's why 4844 is important, because like, you get it from, I don't know what, like $1 to 5 cents for like a typical transaction. And then that means that, this, in the same way that application providers, subsidize their AWS fees, you could imagine a venture-backed application sub. So you're basically getting because you want to kind of get to the point where where the transaction fees are effectively zero. There's no friction. I always think of it as like we've got to at least get to kind of Web 2 parity. We've got to at least get to the sort of user experience parity with like traditional web experiences, and then have additional valuable things on top of it. Is kind of where I think we really need to get to application product market fit, right? And so asking the user to pay $1 with a big scary pop-up, and they may get, if it's the wrong hexadecimal code, they send their money to the wrong place. Like that's not acceptable. And we're now at the point where you're really kind of getting to that, which means that a lot of the activity should move to the application layer. And for that, though, I think, not to again harp on policy, but like that, the thing we're finding in our investment portfolio with our companies is that the regulatory stuff is a really huge issue, because they can't build the products they want to build because of their lawyers are telling them not to do this and don't do this with a token or this or that, and with a wallet, and there's no, and the SEC and other regulators won't put out guidance, and so it's all getting decided by court cases, which are now contradictory court cases. So which court case do you rely on? And so it's just very confusing, and it's hard enough to build a startup, and now you can't build the product you want to build, and you've got to like you've got like a team of lawyers in every product meeting. And so, but I do think on the optimistic side, I think we're, for those who follow this, like there's just a bill passed in the House called Fit 21. I think that hopefully I believe in the next year, we'll get that bill, go through the Senate, and I think will become law. I think is a good likelihood. I'm spending a lot of time on it, and a lot of other people are. And that will be a huge unlock, provide a lot of clarity on the token side of things. And so I think there's a lot of good momentum. There's a lot of it's a bipartisan effort, and there's a lot of support there. So I think that, the infrastructure, there's a bunch of reasons to be very bullish in the next year or two. And so, but it takes time, and so you got to stick it out.
So let me open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, please come up to the mics, and be nice to have some conversation. Great. Yes. Yeah, Aline, why don't you go first?
Thanks for your thoughts, Chris. Really interesting. I have a question about privacy. So can you speak a little bit to the privacy for on-chain transactions, and kind of this tension between normal folks like me wanting to have privacy for our transactions and the unreasonable regulations that cannot be reconciled with this basic need for hiding who I'm paying and how many coffees I'm getting per day?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a good question. And we've made a bunch of investments like, Aztec and some others in that area. I think you can't have things like medical applications and financial applications, like people are not going to put their credit card transactions on chain publicly, right? They're not going to put their medical records on chain publicly. Like you need some level of privacy. I think that the challenge, again, I'm going back to policy here, but that's kind of on my mind. It's really the kind of issue, is that you've got these things like mixers and Tornado Cash, and that in policymakers' mind, privacy means, illicit finance. And so I think what we need, and look, the reality is, forget about your political views. I know some people in crypto think that it should be legal to do mixers, and it's never going to fly. It's not going to be legal. Like there's no way that's ever going to be a thing. So I think the right kind of product question is, how do we build systems that provide privacy, that balance these two things, right? That provide privacy for users, and I think you definitely need privacy for a lot of application use cases, but also, make it impossible to do, or make it difficult and aid law enforcement to do these, and I think there's a lot, I mean, you guys are the experts here. I think like the zero knowledge proof stuff is really interesting. I think, it doesn't make sense that you have to provide, like think about how many times you provide like your social security number and all this information you provide, and you provide, all this stuff to a random local insurance company who then gets hacked. I think everyone's been hacked now. They don't even report headlines anymore when they've been hacked, right? How many times does your private information get hacked? I get these letters, it's like, you get to get free credit reporting, or it's ridiculous, right? It's like that's going to do anything.
More free credit reporting than I know what to do with.
And that's of course absurd. Like you get these, it doesn't work. And so it's just a bad system, right? And like the right system is you should reveal only what you need to reveal, right? To any provider, like if it's a financial provider, like you should reveal enough to prove your credit score, and no more, right? And so that's one layer of privacy, right? And then
Chris, actually, let's try to get through a few more.
And then the other thing is just like, how do you then also allow like law enforcement to get involved in certain cases and things too, which is just going to be a legal requirement.
I think we call this compliance privacy. So.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of, you got Dan, you're the expert and folks here, but I feel like this is one of these problems that can really, a lot of it can be solved through cryptography and technology.
Yeah.
Or
Great answer. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so thank you. It was a very nice conversation. And Chris, you had very good content in your book. So I have some questions. So like we've seen the disruptive technologies like blockchain networks like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and now a lot of startups focusing on infrastructure, right? Can we move up? And when you said that anything that can be represented in a code can be put in a token, sold, brought, embedded, stored, transferred, or whatever a person might want to be, like just like the unpretentious internet, early internet. What do you think, do we have that moment, or, because I see most of the startups are still focusing on the infrastructure side, right? For example, I see professor working at Chainlink focusing on asset tokenization. Do you think we are at a stage where we can focus on the application side more than the infrastructure for this blockchain networks?
Yes, I do. As I was saying before, like I think for example, the infrastructure is for the first time probably at a point where it's good enough for a lot of applications. So like think about what became popular like 3 years ago. It was mostly like DeFi kind of applications where you were moving $1,000, let's say, or $10,000, or transacting or trading, and so you didn't mind a $10 gas fee, right? But if you had like a social network or a game and you had a $10 gas fee, that would just be absurd, right? So I think many application categories just require zero or almost zero gas fees. And so we're, I think probably, hopefully at that stage or close to that stage. I think that's one. I think, look, the second thing is just, again, I'll repeat it again, but the policy stuff, like right now you make a game and like, is an NFT a security? Is a token a security? Like, it's just all of these questions. And like, we were just talking backstage about how like, he was just met with an interesting company that had a multi-sig design, and they had to kill it because the lawyer said the multi-sig thing might trip up an accounting rule. Like, it's just kind of like, I don't know how you build software with that kind of, those kind of constraints. So, but I think we're finally at a point where, I'm hoping we'll see a bunch more. Like what we need though is I see it on Twitter, people are like, the VCs aren't funding enough of this stuff. Like, I think it's half our portfolio's application layer, so at least we are funding these things, but I think that one is the infrastructure, the policy stuff, but then two is the talent. We need to attract more. I think a lot of kind of good product builders right now perceive crypto as either too kind of infrastructure heavy or too kind of gambling, meme coins, casino.
The speculation.
Yeah,
right?
yes, exactly. And I think that's a real branding kind of problem with the space. And I think it's a sort of a hangover from FTX and a bunch of other kind of bad incidents. But, and I think the way to fix it is applications. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? Like we kind of need, I think having one or two big breakout applications that really clarify to people and make it crystallize to people why this is important and different. Mm-hmm. Think about how ChatGPT galvanized the AI movement and brought tens of thousands of good founders into that space building applications. I think similarly, we need sort of a break. Like I think the bad news is kind of a chicken egg thing. The good news is it really just takes one application to really kind of galvanize and get a bunch of people in.
But then there's also folks in the DC that holds a constraint threshold.
I'm sorry, what was it?
But there's also folks in the DCs or the legal side or the government side that holds a certain threshold constraint to the, that holds the barrier high for the applications to enter in this space. Do you think that, or because you manage the fund, right? You have the portfolio. Do you see that's happening, applications, or? Sorry,
I just didn't hit, you said because of DC?
Because there are also folks like the government or the folks or the legal stuff in the DC, right? They hold a high barrier threshold for certain things that cannot be done by the startups, right? Do you think that's going to change soon?
You mean just the regulation? That
the regulation for these networks.
I hope so. That's what I was saying before with if we get some bills passed and things, I think it would be a huge improvement. It's just very hard. It's very hard. I think on an average company that if we fund a $10 million Series A, they spend at least a couple of million on lawyers and legal fees. So that's expensive, but really the problem is not the money as much as the constraints it puts on what they can build and the time sink and everything else. So it's a huge issue. I mean, we're also, by the way, having this we're involved in the policy stuff around AI right now, because I think there's a risk that they're going to do the same thing to open source AI. If you follow the debate going on in California right now with this really terrible, ridiculous bill that's going to basically kill the AI movement there. Europe already pre-killed AI in Europe with the AI Act. Yeah. And so yes, I think that people that don't realize how delicate and fragile startups are, don't realize that when you sort of put 10 agencies on them and start subpoenaing them, it's very hard for startups to survive in that environment. It's widely believed in the internet world that GDPR was a giant gift to Meta and Google. Yep. And really hurt the startup community because it's very hard if those GDPR is a European Privacy Act, it's very hard for startups to comply with it. By the way, you also have everything's now littered with these pop-ups and all this. It's just a whole bunch of secondary adverse consequences of regulation when it's not well thought out. But
sure. So let's try to get through a few more questions. Quintus, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I think probably related to the previous question, you mentioned low barriers to entry, low switching costs are some of the key benefits of some of the things we can build in the sort of broader crypto industry. And at the same time, you mentioned people raising big rounds because you need long runway to work on these difficult problems. But I'm curious, it sometimes feels like this heavily open sourced, heavily transparent, low barriers to entry kind of world we're trying to create also can be at odds or in tension with the ability to have sustainable business models. And I'm curious if you think there is that tension and if you have some sort of a taxonomy of the kind of business models that we have seen to be proven out or may still see to come maybe in different regulatory environments.
No, that's a great question. I mean, to me, this is sort of what's beautiful with the token model. So you think about it, just take Ethereum as the example, right? Where what's beautiful about that is you've got the token is kind of the economic model and the business model and ideally the incentive model. Therefore, there's no incentive to lock up your code. And ideally everyone's aligned around the kind of the network and they're trying to build it out. And now that's the idealization, right? The reality is the tokens aren't necessarily distributed to the people that are building in the right way, because it's whoever happened to buy it early or whatever. The other kind of negative consequence of tokens is that it can create a kind of mercenary financialized culture where, I think Bitcoin's the example of this, where it's just everybody seems to be obsessed with the price and less with building. I think Ethereum is much better on building. than that. And so that there's risks to the token model, but that's in theory sort of the beautiful, elegant thing that the token solves for, is it kind of lets you do the open source model while also having a financial model that incentivizes innovation.
So I'm curious on how you view the relationship between token models and business models, because I'm not really an expert in this field, but if I was asked about Ethereum's business model, I'd say it's like gas fees, and the token is just the ownership structure. So do you think like gas fees are the only way to, this like usage infrastructure fees are the only way to give tokens value?
I think it's interesting. So I think gas fees or like, or sort of a usage fee, like a percentage, I think people are talking about having a fee switch stuff on like DeFi networks. So they take the idea they would take like 0.1% of every transaction. So if you have money, basically you have money flowing through the system, like if it's most of these blockchain systems do, you can have the network. How does Ethereum work, right? Essentially it's charging you to use the network, and then it's using that money it makes to burn tokens, right? I think it does two things. It pays out validators for a security budget, and then it burns tokens, right? And so in effect, what that means is that the token holders benefit from the gas fees, and there's a nice relationship, right? The greater the demand for the network, in theory, then the greater that also creates upward pressure on the token. And so I think it's an elegantly designed system in that way. And it should align, in theory, it would align the price of the token to the usage of the network, which I think is a good alignment, because you want everyone working together to, like in this case, right, with Ethereum, like how do you make the price go up? Well, you get gas fees to go up. How do you get gas fees to go up? You create useful applications. Like that's a good incentive loop, right? A bad incentive loop is one where people are incentivized to just go shill it or something, or not actually build things, right? Now, none of this is fully figured out. I have a couple of chapters in the book on the token model where I try to go through this in detail, and I don't think it's fully figured out, but I think to me the tokens are an incredibly interesting new way to think about internet business models where you can sort of align incentives across all the different parties of the network that are participants in the network.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Let's take one more question and then.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. You mentioned what blockchains are good for. And I wanted to ask if there's a couple more things that I have in mind and how you think about them, whether they are relevant or not. One is kind of a consortium of like banks worldwide trying to replace clearinghouses as they stand right now.
Yeah.
And the other is a non-financial application where you have just data being stored in a way that you don't need a central party to manage this amount of data. Yeah. And that could be in a wide area of applications, such as starting from the supply chain, where you have a bunch of people handling a lot of different products, and they want all these products to be stored in a way that it's an append-only structure, after all, blockchain. So it could be very useful there, and I have an application in mind for that. And the other is for a radical democracy, where you just trust less your representatives and you go directly on the blockchain and say what you want. And you don't do that just for the governance of the blockchain itself, but for the whole of society. And whether you think, like, are these reasonable or are they completely out of the picture for some reason?
Well, I think, so the first couple are easier to answer. So I think with like the bank consortium, I think the way to think about it is, so like, let's say and it's funny, I was just at Goldman Sachs having this conversation. But like, let's say you're Goldman Sachs and you deal with 10 other banks, and you want to create a trading system with those 10 banks, right? The right way to think about a blockchain is it's not solving a technical problem for them, it's solving a political problem, right? So the technical problem is if they look at it as a technical solution, it's like, well, it's a database, right? It's a database, it's a ledger, but that's not really what it's solving a political solution, which is these 10 banks don't like each other, and they don't trust each other. And so how are they going to work together on a common system in a way that they know that the other 9 are not going to rug them, right? Now, how do you do that? Like, historically, you can try to create a nonprofit. Like, forget about blockchains for a second. You create a nonprofit. Okay, well, how do you get great developers to work there? People have tried that. It hasn't worked. Mozilla and OpenAI started as nonprofits. They pivoted to for-profit. You can create a for-profit that are jointly owned. People have done that. It's very hard to pull off. It's very hard to hire the developers, right? A blockchain is a way for like 10 parties, let's say like a bank or someone else, who don't trust each other and maybe don't like each other, to get together and build on a common system, and a system that has its own funding mechanism, can hire developers, can piggyback off all the work you guys have done in the open source and world and everything else. To say it's like an L2, like what I recommended to the banks is like, you guys should do like an L2 like base, you know, like build off of the Ethereum world.
A foundation of sorts.
What's that?
A foundation.
Yeah, so just like, yeah, and so then you can build like a, whatever they want to do, like stuff that today, there's still a ton of financial stuff in the world that's still done on the phone, like bond trading and things, or on Bloomberg terminals, and they want to create an exchange, kind of an AMM type thing among a bunch of untrusted counterparties, and that's a really interesting way to do it. So that was the radical democracy thing is probably beyond my, I'll probably defer to the governance experts. I mean, that's a whole different like political science question that I don't know if I'm qualified to answer, but I think it's interesting to see people running these experiments, and I think that's one of the interesting things of the whole crypto world is that you're kind of, people say you're speed running, you know, governance, all these governance experiments. Like we work with Andy Hall, your colleague at Stanford, who's a political science professor, and they're running all sorts, they're sort of looking and, you know, using blockchains as kind of a test bed to think about all sorts of different interesting governance structures. So I'll defer to the experts on the topic specifically, but I do think it's like we've got this really interesting environment to test these things that we didn't have before. And probably, yeah, something like you're describing should be tested obviously at a smaller scale in the internet community, and if it works, potentially could be, you know, broadened out.
What about the supply chain applications?
I think, again, like supply chain thing, again, it's probably interesting in that it allows a bunch of businesses who don't trust each other to work together and to have sort of a common substrate infrastructure that they can all build on that has its own funding mechanism and its own programming language. And, you know, so similar like stable coins, like why, it's not like a bank could do what a stable, like it could have a ledger and keep track, they obviously do that today, they keep track of your balance. But what a stablecoin, say built on Ethereum does, is it now provides a shared infrastructure that all these different banks can use, right? Which is a network, going back to my book, it's a network, right? It's like now you've got to, and it's not, so if you just look at it, that's what mistake a lot of people make is they look at blockchains as a database. If you look at it as a database, it's not that, it's sort of a slow, not that interesting data, but you have to look at it as a network. And networks, you know, when you understand the history of the internet, you understand the networks are very, very important sources of power and influence and, you know, economic power that now you've got a new way to build them and a way for like all these, so supply chain, I assume there's, you know, many thousands of counterparties in those supply chains who, how do they want to interact with each other in a way that they aren't going to, that they're going to trust those intermediaries. So I do think it's interesting. But you got to think of it that way, as like a way to solve a political problem and not a technical problem.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. What a wonderful way to end the session. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Okay. We'll see you all tomorrow, bright and early at 9 a.m.